Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Ocean Pavilion's Meet the Blue Expert event. My name is Heidi Johnson, and I'm a Vermont Law School student delegate for COP26. Not too long ago, I was a member of an environmental nonprofit organization that removed litter from parks, beaches, mountain areas throughout San Diego, California. I often spent weekends sifting through sand for small pieces of plastic or digging through brush for food containers. Through this experience, I developed a passion for protecting the environment and spreading environmental issue awareness. I was also inspired to take action by pursuing a career in international environmental law. As a student at Vermont Law School, I enjoy learning about international climate change and ocean law. As a COP26 student delegate, I'm thrilled to set COP26 off with this meaningful youth event. COP is the supreme decision-making body of the convention, serving as the meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and all documents that come from the convention, including the Paris Agreement. The COP meets every year, unless the parties decide otherwise, and it has been hosted by countries all around the world. This year, the UK is the host, and the outlined priorities are in mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. During this session, we will hear from a blue expert who will discuss the ocean climate nexus and its role in COP negotiations. Then, we will provide an opportunity for attendees to ask questions. But first, I would like to ask attendees to introduce themselves. Please share with us your name and what country you're in. I can start by calling on Andrea Salazar.
Hi, good morning. My name is Andrea Salazar and I'm from the United States.
Thank you. Caroline Fulham.
Hi, my name is Caroline Fulham and I'm from the United States.
Thank you. Next, we have Gabriela Carmona. Gabriela? Okay. Next we have, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, please correct me, Sheikh Amadou Bamba. No.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. I'm a student in Senegal, in Fisheries and Aquaculture Institute in University of Cheikh Anta Diop, Dakar. And I'm not here for participate on the webinar.
Oh.
Okay. I haven't more idea about this, but now I'm here.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Next we have Guillermo Leroux. Okay, I think we're having. We have Henning Kradzum. Okay. Igor Pessoa.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in coral reefs, and I am from Brazil.
Oh, great, thank you. Next, we have Ioana Jin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ivona Jean, and I'm from Nausicaa in France.
Thank you, Ivana. And we'll do a couple more. We're running low on time, but let's see. We have Christina O'Keefe.
Hi, my name is Christina O'Keefe, and I am a student observer delegate with Vermont Law School, and I'm in Vermont in the United States.
Okay, great, thank you. And Lenore Vera? Leonore Vera? Okay. Okay, we will do Mackenzie Vindas. Okay. And if I missed you, if you want to just type your name and your country in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. Or if your audio wasn't working, that would be appreciated. Thank you. All right, so thank you all for introducing yourselves. I'm delighted to see youth joining us from all over the world. Now, please welcome our climate negotiator and ocean champion, the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, Angelique Pouponneau.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Heidi, are you okay with sound? Do you hear me well?
Yes, I do.
All right, great. Greetings, everyone from COP26. Thank you for the opportunity to come and share my story with you and listen to your question and answer some of your questions, your comments. Love to hear from the young people, the really one of the biggest parts of why we're here at COP26. So I just want to give you a quick feel of the room, the space right now where I am, just so you see what's really going on here. So as you can see, sitting space has not been a strong point already at COP26. We are currently in the on the World Leaders Summit. And we are Thursday, so a lot of ministers, presidents coming in and out, which means that a lot of people are here, and we are hopefully about to hear more political ambition. But if I go back now to myself, my name is Angelique Pouponneau, and I'm from the Seychelles. I just in terms of my background, I'm a lawyer by profession. I studied bachelor's of law in the United Kingdom. And then I became very passionate about the issues of sustainable development, very much thinking about how small island developing states are being affected by climate change and how do we balance development versus conservation. So this was definitely of interest. I established a chapter of a youth-led organization in the Seychelles called the SIDS Youth Aims Hub Seychelles. And this was a youth-led organization working towards the inclusion of young people in decision-making at both national and international levels. In fact, it's quite unfortunate. This is the first year that the Seychelles delegation doesn't have a full-blown youth delegation. We do have a youth delegate with us, but at the same time, we used to have a group of young people called the Seychelles support team that would be supporting the COP and the official delegation. So this is something that I've advocated for within the NGO, and we've seen it have fruit. It's an unusual year this year, so unfortunately, this has not been possible. Now, given that I'm a lawyer, very passionate about the environment, I decided to marry my profession and my passion. So I went off to do a master's of law in environmental law. And with that, I was able to specialize in law of the sea, as well as climate change law. And since then, I've been trained as a negotiator for climate change under the fellowship of the Alliance of Small Island States. And that was in 2018. I've since been following negotiations, predominantly adaptation and loss and damage. But this year is an exciting year for me. I will be a coordinator for AOSIS, so I will be speaking on behalf of 44 group membership for the subject of response measures. So definitely a lot of excitement. I'm I'm now going to be able to not only represent my country, but also the greater group, and that is the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. Heidi, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. Sorry. So thank you for providing your valuable insight, Angelique. It's truly inspiring to listen to your story and all of your involvement from a young age in the ocean and climate advocacy, both at home and abroad. Next, let's see. Good. We can open the floor to questions. You can raise your hand using the function in the Zoom, and I will call on you for our host to unmute. Or you can also drop your question into the chat in English, Spanish, or French, and I will pose the questions to Angelique.
Heidi, if there's no questions, happy to go into more substance about the ocean climate nexus, but love to hear from the audience as well.
Yes, I agree. And to check. I don't see any questions as of now, so if you want to dive into a little bit more of the ocean climate nexus, we would appreciate that.
Okay, so I mean, first off, the COP, right? This what I can only call a manic event, attracting so many people, the conference of the parties, plus a lot of side events. And it was really interesting. Somebody pointed out last week or so that this doesn't actually happen for other treaties, right? Lots of treaties have COPs. You have the conference of the parties for biological diversity. We have conference of the parties for many treaties, but it never culminates into something like this. And it's really because of climate change is something that affects everyone. Inclusion remains pivotal, making sure that there are no voices that are excluded. It's one of the, I'd say, an example when it comes to representation of different groups. We have seen things like having a youth constituency that is able to speak Yungo. We also have more institutionalized bodies such as the Indigenous Peoples platforms that operate within the COP. So really an event and one that brings together technical expertise, negotiations, which is very much international policy making. And while that's all very exciting, perhaps more exciting are the side event space where there's a lot more really showcasing of what is happening on the ground, really showcasing different initiatives and knowledge sharing across the world. It's an opportunity for people to show what's happening at a national level and how it connects to the international space. So this is broadly speaking what a COP is about. Now, I actually operate in both spaces. You've already heard I negotiate on behalf of AOSIS. And as a result, very much aware of the technicalities, the different issues at hand. And what's really important to note is also international politics, right? This isn't just a climate change summit where everybody's moved necessarily just by the science. There's a lot of politics And the negotiations are very much based on regional blocks, countries that are like-minded or countries with similarities. So just to give you an example, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States is cross-regional, right? We come from the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean, and the South China Seas. Now, but what connects us is our similarities as small island nations that are developing, and this is what brings us together. So, but at the same time, there are other negotiating blocks that are based more on region, like the African group. You also have the EU, for example. But then what's interesting, there's also this dichotomy of developed and developing countries. So really thinking about how there are obligations under the Paris Agreement and the Convention that sits under developed countries, and then there are those that sit with developing countries. And obviously, we've seen a change in the Paris Agreement as to that who is meant to take action. Now it's really for the world to take action, whether you're developed or developing. So in that regard, there's a lot to think about. This is not just necessarily sort of, we come in and we say we're going to save the world. There's a lot of politics at hand, and a lot of politics that's very much linked to economic models, the economies of countries. Here you can think about many countries who are still very much dependent on fossil fuel for their development, and also about people, right? It's an issue that cannot be oversimplified. But when it comes to ocean and climate nexus, as somebody coming from a small island developing state, at any point that you stand on in the Seychelles, you can see the mountains at the top and the ocean at the bottom at any point, right? And so for us, that connectivity between the atmosphere and the ocean is very real. We watch the clouds go down from the mountains, it rains onto the sea, and we understand the processes that follow. For other countries that are a little bit far more removed, that connection isn't quite clear. So we have been advocating for quite a long time for the inclusion of ocean within the UNFCCC process. And I can go down a whole other tangent around the lack of synergies and the very siloed approach between international treaties. Ocean is dealt with here, climate is dealt with here, energy is dealt with there. So with this siloed approach, it has meant that there hasn't been the connections that are required to understand how one affects the other. So we have developed these groups called Friends of Ocean Action, and they were very informal at the time. It was mostly around discussions. How could we get this done? But it was only 2019 through a very concerted and coordinated approach where like-minded countries, and I have to say, one of the pivots of success, I would say, of a COP is when you're able to get countries that don't necessarily assign to their traditional blocks to come together and fight and push for a certain agenda. And this is what we saw in 2015, where we had countries from Latin America, we had islands of the Indian Ocean, of the Pacific, larger countries that appreciated the importance of the ocean, that we're all pushing to see how the ocean could be included and integrated into the climate space. And with that, we were able to actually get what started off as a very lengthy decision, but actually become one line in the decision text, but still an achievement nonetheless. It's how these things work. We were able to get an ocean climate dialogue undertaken in after COP25. So there was a decision that was undertaken. Don't get me wrong, it was just not a matter of getting like-minded countries together. There was a lot of opposition to it, right? It came to a point where we were not only going to have a session about ocean and climate, but we needed to have a session about land and climate as well, because countries felt that why did ocean need to be given this undue overview or this undue attention? So of course, there's give and takes, there's trade-offs and compromises that need to be done during negotiations, but we were able to get our ocean climate dialogue. This was able to really show clearly to everyone that there really is an importance for ocean to be part and parcel of the climate discussions. We were successfully able to host that online, regardless of the pandemic. And since then, we've seen other NGOs and other initiatives that has continued this momentum. We are now at COP26, a lot on our minds, not just negotiations, but how do we move from an event to actually institutionalizing something like ocean within the climate space? What do we need to do? Approaches, different ideas. This is certainly something that Seychelles did. We did integrate blue carbon being critical ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass into our NDCs. And then we have other initiatives where people are pushing for like agenda items, which is a little bit more politically sensitive to be able to achieve. But one of the things that we would like to see is we are meant in 2023 to have something called a global stop date. And this is where we're going to all come together as countries and assess how well we've done since Paris. And where we also feel that ocean can come out very strongly based on the input that it has received from the various reports and bodies that are constituted under the convention. So this is a little bit about, the momentum that we've started under ocean and climate, how we're continuing to push it ahead. Just last night, there was another signature of another because of our ocean declaration. I can send you the link for that. But this is just to show you how we are working with ocean and climate within one space, how it is removing the siloed approach, but bear in mind, not without resistance and bringing people together and really educating everyone about why this is so important. So definitely something that needs a concerted and coordinated approach. I'll stop there and see if anyone has questions. I know there were participants from a fisheries background, coral reef background, and I mean, if you're working on the ground, you know what I'm talking about. Climate change is affecting fisheries from destroying their habitats, from also just making them migrate because the water temperatures have changed. And also coral reef, of course, with ocean acidification and more frequent coral bleaching events. But one of the things we need to think about when we're acting on the national level is how do we translate much of that into international policy making? And that in itself requires that strategic thinking and understanding what can be seen to be quite a complicated process. But I think we've unlocked the door, and I think there's really an opportunity to get more of ocean into the climate space. Heidi, I'll hand it back to you. But happy to take any questions.
Yes, we have Ivana Jin from Nausicaa who has a question. She asks, what are your expectations of the COP26 negotiations in relation to the ocean climate nexus?
Thank you for that question. It's a great one. I mean, our expectations is it may be there's a lot going on at this COP. We would love for us to find a way to institutionalize the ocean climate dialogue, so we have it more periodically, that this wasn't just a one-off. But there's a lot going on at the COP, so I think the expectations have to be well managed. This may be seen by some as a distraction to, as you know, the three main pillars right now is ambition, finance, as well as completing the Paris rulebook. So this may be seen as somewhat of a distraction. We hope that isn't the case, because at this in a decision text. But one of the things that we're pushing for is to ensure that Ocean is getting into the global stocktake, which data is already being collected and information already being collected now. But it will then feed into next year's, into the 2023 GST.
Thank you. We also have another question from Gabriela Carbona. She asks, if you have concrete actions, please feel free to look at, oh, I'm sorry, she's directing people to a website with more information. But I was actually going to ask a question. Oh, sorry, we have a question from Professor Ryder. She asks, can you talk a little bit about the role of youth in influencing negotiations?
Absolutely. Young people are pivotal to the negotiations. I already mentioned that, UNFCCC is perhaps one of the few, if not the only, convention that has an official youth constituency for Yungo. But let's talk more practically, how can young people, and what is the role of youth? And two, how can they actually do it? I think it's important that young people remain the conscience of these negotiations. The people making the decisions today are probably not going to be around to live with the decisions that they're taking. They're very much going to be, young people are going to be inheriting decisions automatically, and they're not even in the room. This is something that you need to take very seriously, and you need to make sure that your voice is being heard. And there are different ways to do that. It doesn't need to start at COP. In fact, it starts at home. When you're speaking to your governments, you need to, when they're announcing that they're heading to COP and they're having their fancy delegations, you need to have a chat with them. What is it that they are going to be talking about there? And is it in your interest? What positions are they going to be taking? And how are they going to make sure that the voices of young people are being heard from the Seychelles? One of the things that we've seen is a youth declaration that has come out of the Conference of Youth. Mind you, there was a time I recall when I was in the SIDS Youth Aims Hub and leading that, we were able to do a youth declaration and printed out loads of copies for our ministers and said, if anybody asks, what does your young people feel? Please hand them that declaration. And it was also a reference point where they would be able to say, we consulted with our young people and this is what they thought. So it starts at home. We don't need to wait for COP to have an influence. But then when we do get to COP, oftentimes having young people as part of the delegation or engaging with young people is important, because at the end of the day, when you get those young people in the space, they're able to almost hold their delegations to account. They are there to say, your decision right now sounds a lot like it's only thinking of the present. Sounds a lot like they're not thinking about what's going to happen in my future. And I think that's really important for young people to continue to be that moral conscience, not just of the negotiations, of the delegations, and all the decisions that they're going to automatically inherit in the coming years. So I'd say young people have a critical role. Don't underestimate it. And again, if you're not at COP, write a letter, get a blog published. We need to make sure that young people's voices are being heard, and don't ease up on the pressure. People need to be held accountable for the decisions that they make.
Thank you. We have another question from Andrea Salazar. She asks, what advice do you have for someone new to COP26?
Sorry, my delegate colleague is checking on me. So what advice do you have for someone new to COP26? Well, be prepared. It's a big event. There are some really nice succinct books about issues, if you're interested in issues, where you have these small pocket guides to loss and damage, small pocket guides to response measures, and so on. You don't have to be new at COP. I used it myself when being appointed as the EOSIS response measures coordinator. wanting to get a history and what's been achieved. So that's very helpful. But also go in for a reason. And I know this isn't necessarily what people like to hear, but it can get very easy to just be sitting in a corner because there's so many things going around you and you don't even know where to start. So go in for a reason. If it's networking, find out who's going to be there. If it's knowledge sharing, go on that side event website, identify what's going on, where you need to be, locate your pavilion and your venues, and do that. If you're going in for negotiations and you want to understand a particular stream, at no point are you going to be able to follow everything. And that's what you'll do next, right? Identify, learn about that stream, learn about response measures, learn about how things are being allocated. Is there coordination? Are there contact groups? Learn those bits and pieces. And then from there, you'll be able to better manage what you're trying to achieve. When you reach my stage, maybe you try to do a bit of everything, which is what I'm finding myself doing. But I'd say coming in new, identify your objectives and work towards achieving it.
We also have a question from Sheikh Amadou Bamba. He asks, what effects could climate change have on the exports of companies, particularly fishing companies?
Sorry, Heidi, export companies, especially fishing?
Yes, what effects could climate change have on the exports of companies, particularly fishing companies?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways of looking at this at different levels. So when it comes to export companies, and I know this well in the sense that Seychelles hosts one of the biggest Indian Ocean tuna canning factory. So when it comes to climate change, if you're dependent like the Seychelles on tuna, and tuna is a pelagic fish, which means it's very much affected by water temperatures in terms of where it lives and where it hangs out. What you will find is that the tuna moves to cooler waters. So as your waters get much warmer because of the increasing temperatures, the tuna migrates as well. They don't think, oh, I need to hang out in Seychelles waters. They go to where the habitat is conducive for them. So as a result of that, that means that over time when they are caught, the landing site for the tuna, for the catch, is actually no longer Seychelles. The port is much further away. And what happens is very interesting. I mean, at some point, it does mean that Seychelles, for example, as a country, loses a lot in terms of port services. And that in itself affects the economy tremendously, especially small economies. But the other thing that happens, and I think this is absolutely ridiculous, is that occasionally, maybe more often than we think, even though the tuna is landed in, I don't know, in Sri Lanka, for example, it is then flown back to Seychelles or shipped back to Seychelles for it to be canned there, because that's where the canning factory is. So you can see how we're actually, it's almost a terrible cycle of climate change is affecting fisheries and this export industry because its raw material is being affected. And then they take action that affects themselves because of the high emissions associated with like flying or shipping tuna back to Seychelles for it to get canned and then for it to be sent off again. But there's also other aspect of looking at this when it comes to climate change. And this is new for me as well, but response measures, thinking about what national policies are being put in place by developed countries as a result of climate change. So are they, for example, saying no more imports of a type of fish or of fish that is caught in a certain way, or that is being transshipped, or that is being exported in a certain way, and that will affect economies in developing countries. And also thinking about that is another way that export industries will be affected. A very simple example is was a case study recently done in Ghana, and it basically showed that and here, I'm thinking of palm oil, which has its own, issues. But in Europe, although Ghana exports palm oil, when Europe takes certain decisions like no longer importing palm oil because it's emissions intensive, Ghana needs to start thinking what it's going to do with its palm oil. Does it stop producing palm oil? Does it export to other countries? And if they're affected in that way, then what are their solutions? What do they need to think about? What about economic diversification, but also just transitions, right? How are we making sure that when all these impacts are taking place, how are we making sure that people are also people behind businesses are also being taken into consideration? Yeah, very interesting. But of course, as I said, climate change is very difficult to simplify. It's very complex.
Yeah, and when you were speaking a little bit about blue carbon, I think you froze. And so I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about what the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust is doing to include blue carbon in the Seychelles NDCs.
Okay, absolutely. So, just for folks who are not familiar with blue carbon, so it's referring essentially to the critical ecosystems like salt marshes, seagrass, and mangroves. And these are ecosystems that are able to capture and store carbon within their root system. And that just means that the carbon is not being released into the atmosphere. Now, how do we ensure that they're still able to continue and perform this ecosystem service? So this is where this is of interest to the climate change realm. So the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, SeyCCAT, what essentially we've been working on is partnering with the government of Seychelles to say, how is our seagrass meadows? One second, there's a little bit of rowdy noise here. Okay, how is our seagrass meadows, which we have a lot of, able to continue to perform this ecosystem service for the world? This is not only for Seychelles, right? It's absorbing carbon from everywhere. But in order to do that, we need to do two things. We need to understand just how much seagrass do we have? How much of this ecosystem do we have? And then secondly, we need to also understand what actions do we need to take in order to protect or sustainably manage those ecosystems. So what the government of Seychelles has now committed to doing is a full mapping of all the seagrass meadows in the exclusive economic zone of the Seychelles. SeyCCAT has facilitated a partnership with the necessary funding and the necessary expertise, as well as capacity building for local actors to be able to learn how to do that. And once we have done that, we have also endeavored to protect, and protection here is based on our Seychelles Marine Spatial Planning process, but to protect 50% of our seagrass meadows by 2025 and 100% by 2030 should funding be made available. So this is the commitments that the government of Seychelles has made. They're ambitious. They have attracted a lot of attention, but at the same time, we need to make sure that they're realistic. We're confident that we will meet the first targets. However, we know to increase ambition always requires finance. And this is really what the negotiations are about here, right? Developing countries cannot continue to up their ambition, but the finance is not being delivered. There's going to be a mismatch. We're not going to be able to actually deliver on this ambition. So with that in mind, this is what the second leg of that commitment is. It's indicating we will go for 100%, but it has to mean that we're getting some external support in order to achieve that. And this is a little bit about the work that we've done, but in order to keep it quite local, we've made sure that there are capacity building elements. We've made sure that this isn't a parachute science when scientists fly in with technical expertise, leave with all the equipment and their technical expertise. So there's real capacity building for the local population. And at the end of the day, we're going to have monitoring programs in order for the population to be aware if there are any changes to this blue carbon habitats. So this is a little bit about what we've been doing, and we think that's the the best way to deal with this. I know we've been working with Vermont Law School, with Professor Reiter, on looking at how to make sure that these commitments are climate just. And very much, in fact, I think the article's now in the chat. So very much something that we'd like to ensure, right? Even though you have commitments, we always need to make sure that they're climate just, and they work for both the ocean and the people and the coastal communities that depend on it.
Not yet.
Thank you. Yes, I read that paper and it was very informative. There's a link to that in the chat. There is Professor Reiter also has a question. Is the 30 by 30 initiative popping up at COP26?
Thanks for that question. Yes, 30 by 30 is popping up, not within formal negotiations, but certainly within side events. Now, many people may ask, what's the relevance of side events? It is a showcase. It is about knowledge exchange. But if you manage to get negotiators in your side event, it might start to juggle their minds as to what could possibly be included within negotiations and for them to connect with the people working in that space. So at the moment, I've seen one event so far that is based on 30 by 30 and climate change. I'll actually be one of the negotiators who will be in the room to find out more about what the organizers are suggesting in terms of how marine protection, and that's 30% by 2030, can help us address many of our climate goals.
Great, thank you. Christina O'Keefe also has a question. Can you speak more about climate justice within those commitments and within the ocean climate nexus?
Thanks, Christina. I'm just gonna let this group of people pass by. So climate justice within commitments, right? We want to make sure, so there's so many levels of climate justice. Okay. It's something that it needs to be a common thread within the process to think about how things are just for people. And coming from an island state, I talk about the triple injustice, right? I always speak about that triple injustice. And here I'm thinking slavery, colonization, climate change, right? Thinking about how other people's actions have affected our countries and our people. Now, when it comes to addressing climate change, these are not talked about, but they're not obviously the elephant in the room, right? And we've tried to steer away from, issues of historical responsibility in recent times. And that's only because we want to see more progress, and we know whenever we bring it up, it somewhat stalls progress. But it has to be alive. It has to be live, right? There is no climate justice without thinking of the balance between developed and developing countries, about the people who cause this and the people who are bearing the brunt of it. And then when we make commitments, now that we have the Paris Agreement, we're all meant to make commitments. It's not just for one group of countries to make commitments. So as a developing country, when we make commitments, it has to be just in the grand scheme of things. We cannot continue to A, make commitments and then not receive support, or B, make commitments and to an extent affect our own countries when we did not have much to do with where we are, but having to make sacrifices because of another group of countries who continue not to take their responsibilities. So climate justice is a narrative that runs throughout this process. I think it's very much the elephant in the room. We know it's there. It's how we tiptoe around it, not to disturb it, but it's on everyone's mind, and some people want to avoid it, and some people want to bring it up as a real issue. Now, when it comes to the ocean climate nexus, one of the ways to support climate action is protection of the ocean space. And some of it is the critical habitats, and some people go for general protection of marine space. With protection, there often comes a sensitivity around whether that means exclusion, whether you're going to start excluding certain people and activities from these spaces. And that's very sensitive. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's all in the process and the how you deliver on these things. For example, Seychelles has 2 levels of protection. Yes, you have your no-take zones, but you also have sustainable use zones, right? These are the zones where you're still able to take on certain activities. And this is definitely something that, as countries, when decisions are made or commitments are made, it's important to have consulted with many of the coastal communities and other people who will be affected. So this is really some of the thinking between how climate justice and the ocean nexus comes together.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. So Ivana Jin from Nausicaa asks, what would you advise young people to do at COP26 to convince the non-believers, i.e. those that don't see the relation between the climate and the ocean yet?
It's not very technical.
I'm being moved. So I'm just going to see how I can best do this. So now with regards to how to convince the non-believers, I think we need to make sure that we have our arguments right. And sometimes it's not necessarily their fault, right? We've got to acknowledge that many of the people in the room are not ocean beings, right? They haven't worked in this space. They're focused on being people who work in their climate ministry. And therefore they have very little to do with their colleagues at the Ocean Affairs Ministry, for example. And as such, we need to have that education process. I think much of the resistance sometimes is in ignorance, right? It's just not knowing why there should be that connectivity. And when you go, remember that the non-believers, and here if we're talking about negotiators, they have very little time. So you need your 3 strongest points. All your government all your government official. No one has time for an elaborate conversation about the ocean climate nexus. And especially if you're seen as that young person going around focused on these things that, we have better things to do or other things to do. So you need to think of your top 3 points, why this is important, what are the connectivity issues, why we should stop working in silos, and go for it. But also remember that once you catch someone's attention, then that could lead to a longer meeting when you can really sit down to this person and you have an opportunity to educate. I think we often assume that everyone has the same knowledge that we possess. And that's obviously often very wrong.
I agree. Thank you. Yeah, that's really, and tying back to when you were speaking of youth and how they can write blogs and kind of spread awareness, I think that really speaks to ways they can do that. Would you agree? To spread that awareness about the ocean climate nexus. Okay, we have a question.
I see another question from Christina.
Yeah, Christina O'Keefe. How willing are developed nations to incorporate the ocean and blue carbon into NDCs?
Some countries are, and we've seen the US, Australia, especially when they have the know-how and expertise to do it. These are not cheap technologies. Obviously there are cheaper technologies that allows you to reach like a tier 1 and tier 2 assessment. But there are more complex technologies for a tier 3 assessment, for example. So in that respect, we have seen some countries do it. Of course, some countries have seen the blue carbon and the ocean conversation as distractions from just curbing fossil fuels, right? And I mean, one of the things that we make very clear when we talk about this is it's not instead of, it is in addition to curbing fossil fuels. So in that respect, many of their NDCs have been more focused on what they're doing to get to net zero and timeframes to do that, and less so on these nature-based solutions. But at the same time, there's some countries who've been doing it before us, you know, it's been done before. And there are some countries who are very strong in that respect. You know, Australia is a country with a lot of expertise around that.
We have a question from Gabriela Carmona. Do you think that you will have concrete actions from all countries in this COP26?
Sorry, Heidi, can you repeat that?
Yes. Do you think that you will have concrete actions from all countries in this COP26?
I don't think so. That's my personal opinion. I think that it's challenging. This is a really challenging COP. We're not back in normal times. I'm delivering this speech still in a mosque because I'm surrounded by people. And in addition to that, there's a lot going on. I mean, I think if we are able to close the rule book, Article 6, I think we would have achieved what we need to achieve here at this COP. And whether that will be something that all countries work towards because the world is watching, I'm not clear on that yet. Maybe I'll do a follow-up at some point halfway through and let you know how negotiations on Article 6 are going. But it's very clear that at the moment, there are countries that are coming in to talk about how the process has been problematic, especially with virtual intercessionals and so on, versus necessarily wanting to focus on the progress that we have ahead. So it's not clear either way, but I'm hopeful, but I'm realistic in my hope, I suppose.
I don't see any other questions. We do have time for more questions if anybody would like to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Angelique, is there anything else that you would like to elaborate on?
Not necessarily, Heidi. I mean, thanks for the opportunity to sort of share my experiences, to share what's going on here as COP. I still consider myself a very sort of young negotiator. And I hope that the story inspires others to get more involved. And, you know, I'm more than happy to share about what's going on here, at least in terms of the atmosphere. I think it's very easy to get like very concrete updates with like thematic changes or what side events are going on. And many of you can now access those in hybrid. But I think one of the things that's missing is always the understanding of the international politics at hand. And of course, whoever controls the media can portray whoever they want as the bad guys. But I think it's important to understand the interests of countries, to understand that we would all love to come in here saying we're going to save the world and the planet. But people are, but we have governments negotiating, right? Which means that there's a level of making sure that your people are well taken care of, your economies are protected, and thinking through how do we support this just transition. And that's something that remains a critical part of this puzzle. Again, you cannot oversimplify this process.
We do have another question. So somebody had commented, Guillaume had commented, keep in mind that the ocean areas beyond national jurisdiction represent more than 50% of Earth's superficie. And then Lisa Levin commented, speaking to Guillaume's comment, how can the states help manage climate issues in the ocean outside their EEZs?
I think this is very much linked to many things. Shipping, for example, there's a lot of activity outside our exclusive economic zone. But at the moment, we are negotiating a legally binding instrument on marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And for example, when it comes to seagrass, there are large seagrass meadows that sit beyond national jurisdictions. And it would be interesting to understand how these critical habitats are managed when it's in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I know there's a conversation about marine protected areas and other areas-based management tools within the BBNJ process, as we call it. So these are things that are ongoing that I foresee could provide the framework for countries to work towards climate action in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But there's also sort of easy wins when it comes to looking at the activities that exist that take place in areas beyond national jurisdiction, like shipping, where we already have existing frameworks and we need to think about how we green the shipping industry, for example. So these are just some examples that I can think of that would be important to see how areas beyond national jurisdictions are also part of this conversation.
Thank you. Yes, and as Professor Ryder notes, you'll be serving on a live panel later this week, which will focus on capacity building and meaningful partnerships. Dr. Levin has another question. Can we push BBNJ to incorporate more climate change recognition and adaptation?
Can we? I think we should. I think obviously the politics at play is a little tricky, but I think we definitely should do that. I think it's all part and parcel of this attempt and effort to make sure that there's less siloed approach. With the word can, I don't remove the square brackets that I'm sure will follow once we push for it. But I think it's important because we cannot focus on an issue in silo, right? Especially when we know that climate is affecting marine biodiversity. And to pretend that this is, not the place to discuss it, or it shouldn't be dealt with here, or whatever attempts are made to marginalize the issue, I don't think is helpful if we're sincere in our political will to conserve and sustainably manage marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction.
Okay, Dr. Levin says thank you. We still have time for some more questions if anybody would like to pop those in the chat or in the Q&A section. Andrea Salazar asks, are there any clear signs during negotiations where you have to balance reality and goals?
Yeah, so when it comes to negotiations, what typically happens is you will find that everyone sort of starts off with their position and interest, right? And then over the week, people are more willing to let go of their very strong positions. Some of them, obviously, if it's a red line, it's a red line. Strong, so they're willing to let go slowly. And then towards the end of it, it's all about trade-offs. So you now go back to your bare minimum. What is it I want to walk away with here? And this is where you get a lot of clarity as to goals and realistically what you're going to achieve in this negotiation. But I think for me, I always find that it's difficult to tell until you're almost at the finishing line, where people are more inclined to be more reasonable, for lack of a better way of saying it, and to be able to reach compromise and reach decision text. And oftentimes, this conversation comes up about, would we achieve more if we had more time? We probably wouldn't. We would just be holding on to our positions until the 3rd week, or the 4th week, or the 5th week. So the 2 weeks is really where you can see that move, right, from a lot of hard positions all the way to something more bridging that is able to bring consensus. And remember, this process is one based on consensus, so that's very important.
I'll just see if anybody else wants to pop questions into the chat or into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll ask a question. Earlier, you were speaking about different groups and the similarities between groups. Do you ever find that within groups there's disagreement as to what those compromises should be, and how do you work together to compromise amongst yourselves within a group?
Absolutely. And it's really, I mean, I'll give sort of the AOSIS example. It's really an interesting one where within AOSIS, of course, you have the Pacific, the Caribbean, and then the ACE region. And what's interesting about that, of course, is some regions are more coordinated than others. So by the time they get to AOSIS, the Caribbean already knows their positions. The Pacific already knows their positions. And then the ACE region, we're sort of spread out in between, and we're a region spread out across many oceans. So we're less coordinated. So there are times when we are not aligned within the group, and we have to sit down and say, look at things either strategically, looking at things like timing. Is this the right time to bring something like this up? And look at things like, maybe there's another way to deal with it. Does it have to be a new agenda item, or can this be dealt with at political high level? Can we take this up with the COP presidency rather than necessarily coming up with an agenda item fight, for example? So there are, it is a process in itself, sitting down within the group and identifying ways of like getting that bridge, right? Making sure that people don't feel neglected, or that they're not being observed or or their views being taken into consideration, but rather to say that for the benefit of the group, this is what we think is the best way forward. But there are other avenues that can be explored, and the group is more than happy to explore those avenues with you. But this is generally the approach that we have. And of course, that's just at AOSIS level. I mean, you can just imagine the diversity of the membership for the G77. And that's another place where we try our best to stay united as a group. We're stronger in numbers. We're the largest group. If we go in as the G77, more than 147 countries. But there are times when we just simply don't agree. And we cannot come up with a solution. And it gets really heated and it gets very emotional. But at the same time, although we try, and sometimes it requires political engagement, like our ministers to come in, our presidents or whoever to come in. That is, there comes a time that we can't maintain group position, and that's when you see us go as sub.
Thank you. Professor Ryder asked, can you speak to the use of language as a tactic in negotiations?
Sure. So again, I won't necessarily call it a tactic. I mean, I think it's a tactic and perhaps a reality, right? Negotiations are conducted in English. It's only when you're in the plenary that you have access to translations. So what that means is that when you're negotiating, you're negotiating in a language that's not necessarily your first language. Like for me, English is not my first language. So I'm negotiating in a language that isn't my first language. But what Professor Ryder speaks to about the use of it as a tactic is often when you're drafting the text, and somebody can say, I'm the one who has English as a first language, and I'm indicating to you that it should be read that way, right? It should be written this way. And this is a grammatical issue. So I'll give you a concrete example about, we had long, lengthy arguments about whether it should read the Convention and the Paris Agreement, or the Convention and its Paris Agreement. And this was a very central issue. It's really an issue about the relationship of the Paris Agreement and the Convention versus whether they're two separate things or whether they're connected. So the language was very relevant. But what we found was an attempt by certain English-speaking countries to say it should read this way, and that's grammatically correct. And you would have being English being your second language, you may fall for that, right? You may think, yeah, they know English. Maybe it is grammatically this way, without appreciating that there could be greater political implications if it's worded in a certain way. So these are the tactics that are used, but it's also a lot of the realities. I have had the opportunity to train Francophone are French-speaking countries, women in Francophone countries about negotiations. And they really struggle with the text. And sometimes it requires them to translate it into French. So you can imagine the loss of time, right? You're translating the document into French, working off it in French, and then translating it back to English for you to engage in the process. So it's quite disadvantageous when you look at language as an issue within the COP process. And to be fair, the COP is moved around every year. Some of the facilities are simply not available to be able to provide the same functions as if you were having the meeting in New York at the United Nations.
Thank you. And actually, just to ask them another question to that, how can someone whose second language is English, and if they're in the room negotiating, or if they're trying to spread awareness and they're feeling like maybe they won't be seen as credible, how can they work to overcome those feelings, especially youth?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one. And I mean, there's so many levels of issues around confidence, whether it's, that old looking ambassador must know more than me, or whether it's that person went to school at whichever university and surely they must know more than me, or whether it's the colonization of the mind, where you look at the person on the other side of the room, and if they look a certain way, you think they must be superior to you in terms of knowledge and know-how, right? So this is a bigger issue than the negotiations, but it's a live issue. Now, so building your confidence, to me, it has to just be around knowing your subject matter. Your knowledge of a language doesn't define how well you know a subject matter, right? A lot of these pocketbooks are available in all languages. And making sure that if you require language support, then part of your delegation is somebody with strong English background. But you definitely also just need to be aware of the issue, so that you don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, because English is their first language, they must know better. So this is a tactic, as Professor Ryder said, it's a tactic. And you just need to be aware of it, so you don't just go, oh yeah, must be this way. And instead you're more critical in the different approaches, tactics, strategies that are used within the negotiations.
Thank you. Not seeing any other questions. If nobody has any additional questions, I can wrap this session up. We do have a couple more minutes or a little bit more time if anybody wanted to ask a question. Okay. Angelique, if you don't have anything else that you would like to add, I can wrap up the session. Thank you for all your insight. We really appreciate it. And thank you for showing us how COP looks and for meeting with us, even when you don't have a set room to do so. And I want to thank everybody else for attending the Virtual Ocean Pavilion's Meet the Blue Expert event. We hope that you are inspired to take action to protect our one global ocean, that which unites us all. For more information on COP26 and the role of the ocean in the climate negotiations, please watch Vermont Law School's 2 pre-recorded sessions, which are coming soon to the on-demand portion of the Virtual Ocean Pavilion. These informative sessions are provided in English and Spanish. Thank you.